The address glowed wrong on my phone screen, but I was already 20 minutes late, and my manager would dock my pay if I took any longer. So I pushed through the gleaming lobby doors of the high-rise anyway, pizza bags balanced against my hip, the heat seeping through my thin jacket. The doorman barely glanced at me, used to delivery people invading his polished domain, and I slipped into the elevator before he could question whether I belonged in this building, where the monthly rent probably exceeded my yearly income. Floor 28. The hallway smelled like expensive candles and money, thick carpet muffling my worn sneakers, and I checked the receipt again because something fell off, but I was too exhausted to care. 3 jobs and not enough sleep, blurring everything into survival mode. I knocked on 2804, waited, heard movement inside. The door opened and my breath caught because the man standing there was shirtless, all carved muscle and dark ink swirling across his chest and shoulders, and his eyes were gray like winter storms, cold and assessing, and a face too handsome to be safe. He looked annoyed, eyebrows drawn together, mouth set in a hard line. But then his gaze dropped to my hands as I reached for the pizza bags, and everything changed. The air itself shifted. His entire body went still in a way that reminded me of predators on nature documentaries. That focused intensity right before the strike. And I realized he was staring at my wrist where my sleeve had ridden up, exposing the finger-shaped bruises Marcus left last night. Those gray eyes snapped back to my face, and I wanted to run, but my feet would not move. Who did this to you? His voice was quiet, controlled, but something deadly moved underneath the calm. I pulled my sleeve down fast, too fast, stammering that it was nothing. I bruised easily. I just needed payment for the pizza. He did not move from the doorway, did not blink. Asked again who put those marks on me, and I lied. Said I was clumsy, bumped into things. Please, I needed to go. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt stripped bare under that gaze. Like he could see every secret I buried, every excuse I made, every time I covered bruises with makeup and long sleeves. Then he stepped back, pulled out his wallet, handed me bills without counting. Way too much. Easily triple the order cost. Keep it. His voice was softer now, but no less intense. I tried to give back the extra, but he closed my fingers around the money, his hand warm and solid, and careful not to touch the bruises. And then he took the receipt and wrote something on it before handing it back. My personal number. When you are ready. I shook my head, said I did not need anything. Thank you for the tip, and finally my legs remembered how to work. I turned toward the elevator, skin prickling because I knew without looking that he watched me. Felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. And when the elevator doors finally closed, I sagged against the wall, heart hammering. Something about him terrified me. Something about him felt like salvation. I should throw away the receipt. I tucked it into my pocket instead. The apartment door stuck like it always did, and I had to shoulder it open, the sound loud enough to wake Marcus if he was sleeping. But I found him awake instead, sprawling on our sagging couch with empty beer bottles lined up on the coffee table like soldiers, his eyes tracking me as I entered, and my stomach dropped because I knew that look, that dangerous glassy focus that meant he had been drinking and thinking, and nothing good ever came from that combination. You took forever. His voice was too calm, the kind of calm that preceded storms. I checked the receipt times and my pulse started hammering because I had taken 47 minutes for a delivery that should have been 20. Too long, way too long. And I scrambled for excuses about traffic and wrong addresses, but he was already standing, swaying slightly, closing the distance between us. Who were you with? Nobody. Just deliveries. My manager sent me across town. I tried to keep my voice level and soothing, the tone I used when he got like this. But he grabbed my arm exactly where the bruises already lived, and white-hot pain exploded up to my shoulder. I gasped, could not stop the sound, and something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe. Before he accused me of cheating, said I smelled different, looked different, was lying to him. I tried to pull away, and he shoved me backward into the kitchen counter, the edge catching my hip bone, and I tasted fear metallic and familiar. He loomed over me, demanding to know who I was seeing, what I was doing, why I was destroying us. And I made myself small, made myself apologize for things I did not do, agreed that I should have been faster, promised nothing was wrong, anything to diffuse this. He stared at me for a long moment, and I held my breath. Then he released me with a sound of disgust and stumbled back to the couch, reaching for another beer. I did not wait to see if his mood would shift again, just walked quickly to the bathroom, locked the door with shaking hands, and slid down to sit on the cold tile floor. Through the thin door, I heard him muttering, then the television blaring too loud. I pulled the receipt from my pocket and studied the number written in bold, confident strokes. 10 digits that represented safety, maybe, or a different kind of danger. I stared at them until they blurred, my mind cycling between desperate hope and paralyzing fear. Because calling that number would mean admitting I needed help, would mean crossing a line I could not uncross. And something about the man who gave it to me, something about the way he moved and spoke and looked at me like he could see straight through to my bones, told me that line was more like a cliff. A point of no return. 3 days passed. 3 days of normal hell. Marcus swinging between cold indifference and explosive rage, me walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate his moods, failing more often than not. 3 days of carrying that receipt in my pocket like a talisman, running my thumb over the numbers until the ink began to smear. 3 days of telling myself I was fine, I could handle this, things would get better if I just tried harder. If I was just better. The lie felt thinner each time I told it. On Thursday evening, I worked a double shift at the diner, the kind of soul-crushing day where everything went wrong. 2 tables complained about cold food, another complained about slow service, the coffee machine broke, and my manager blamed me for the resulting chaos. By the time I clocked out, I was bone-tired and my feet ached, and I wanted nothing more than to collapse into bed. But when I got home, Marcus was waiting, pacing the living room like a caged animal, his eyes wild with whatever combination of alcohol and paranoia had seized him this time. And the moment I walked through the door, he started screaming. About money. About disrespect. About the imaginary man he was convinced I was seeing behind his back. I tried to reason with him, tried to calm him down, but he was past listening, past rational thought. And when he backhanded me across the face, the force of it sent me stumbling into the wall, my vision exploding into stars. Blood filled my mouth, copper and warm, and something inside me broke. Not the way it had broken before, with tears and apologies and promises to do better. This time it broke clean and final. I was done. The bell above the door chimed, and I glanced up automatically, then froze because a black luxury car was pulling into the parking lot outside, sleek and predatory among the rusted sedans and pickup trucks. Completely out of place in this neighborhood where everything was tired and worn down. My heart started hammering before I even saw him emerge from the vehicle, tall and commanding in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, moving with that controlled grace that marked him as dangerous. And when Dominic walked through the diner door, every conversation seemed to pause, people sensing without understanding that an apex predator had entered their space. His eyes found mine immediately, something flickering in that winter gray when he saw me in my stained uniform and cheap sneakers. And he walked to my section, slid into a booth by the window, waited. I grabbed a menu with shaking hands and approached, hyper-aware of Denise watching from behind the counter, of the other waitress, Amy, staring openly, of how badly I did not belong in the same universe as this man. Coffee, he said when I reached the table, his voice quiet and even. And when our eyes met, I felt stripped bare again, exposed, like he could catalog every sleepless hour and every flinch I had hidden. I poured his coffee, tried to keep my hand steady, asked if he wanted anything else, and he said, "Why did you not call me?" I pretended not to understand, said I did not know what he meant, turned to leave, but his hand moved across the table and covered mine, not trapping, just touching, warm and solid and steadying, and I stopped breathing. He held my gaze and slid a business card across the table with his other hand, explained in that same quiet voice that it was a security company. They helped women in difficult situations. Resources and protection for people who needed to disappear. I pulled my hand back and lied. Said I was fine. Everything was fine. He did not need to worry about a stranger. But he leaned back and studied me with something almost like sadness in his expression. "You are a terrible liar, Elena." Hearing my name in his voice did something to my chest, made it hard to pull in air. And I realized he had learned it somehow, had found out who I was, and that should have terrified me. But instead, I felt seen in a way that made my eyes burn. He told me when I was ready, call the number. Someone would answer any time, day or night. And then he stood and placed 2 20s on the table for a $3 coffee and walked out before taking a single sip, leaving me standing there with the business card burning in my pocket and my heart racing and the certainty that everything had just shifted again, tilted further towards something I could not take back. My break came 45 minutes later, and I disappeared into the back storage room with my phone, hands still shaking from the weight of the business card burning in my apron pocket. And I opened the browser and typed Dominic into the search bar, my thumb hovering over the enter button for a long moment, because part of me knew that once I looked, once I confirmed what my instincts were already screaming, everything would become real and irreversible. The search results loaded, and I scrolled through them with my heart climbing into my throat, finding nothing concrete at first, just a few mentions in society pages about charity galas and business acquisitions. A photo of him in a tuxedo looking devastating and untouchable at some fundraiser. But then I found the forums, the rabbit holes where people whispered about things they could not prove. Threads about the family controlling half the organized crime in the city, about Dominic taking over the empire at 19 after his father died in what was officially ruled a heart attack, but unofficially understood as an execution about territory and gambling and protection rackets and violence delivered with surgical precision. I delivered pizza to a Mafia boss. The words repeated in my head like a prayer or a curse, and my stomach twisted because he knew where I worked, knew my name, had tracked me down after one encounter. And that kind of reach spoke to resources and power that should have sent me running. Except he also offered help, extended his hand when he had no reason to care about some broken waitress with bruises she tried to hide. My phone buzzed, and I nearly dropped it. Saw Marcus's name flash across the screen. The first of what would become 15 texts over the next 2 hours, starting with "Where are you?" Then escalating to "Who are you with? And you better not be ignoring me, and I know you are hiding something." Then the whiplash shift to "Baby, I am sorry about last night, and I love you, and please talk to me, and why are you doing this to us?" The pattern was so familiar it made me nauseous. This cycle I had lived through 100 times. His anger followed by remorse, followed by suspicion, followed by promises. Spinning endlessly until I could not remember which version of him was real, or if any of them were. I shoved the phone back in my pocket and returned to the floor. But Denise caught my arm as I passed, her grip firm and her expression tight. "You have been distracted all day, Elena. I cannot have you messing up orders or ignoring customers. You are on thin ice here." The threat was real. This job was one of 3 that kept me barely afloat, and I could not afford to lose it. So I smiled and apologized and promised to focus, then threw myself into work with desperate energy, refilling coffee cups and taking orders and pretending my world was not tilting off its axis. But every time the door chimed, I looked up, half expecting to see him again, half hoping, half terrified. After dinner, I showered, let the hot water pound against my shoulders until the small bathroom filled with steam. And when I came out wrapped in a towel, Marcus was sitting on the bed holding my phone, and the expression on his face made my blood turn to ice. "Who is Michael?" he asked, and his voice was too quiet, too controlled. And I realized with sickening clarity that he had gone through my contacts while I was in the shower, had seen Dominic's number that I had saved under a fake name, because some part of me knew even then that I might need it, might need him. "Just a customer from the diner," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to project the exhaustion and resignation that usually made Marcus back down. But something was different tonight. Something in him had shifted past the point where my surrender would satisfy. "You are lying," he said, standing up, and the phone looked small in his hand, fragile. "Why would a customer give you his personal number? Why would you save it?" I tried to explain, said some people left numbers for carry-out orders, that it did not mean anything, but he was not listening anymore. His face flushing red the way it always did before the violence came. He spat, and the word hit like a fist before his actual hand did, cracking across my face hard enough that I tasted copper. Felt my lips split open again in almost the same place as the half-healed cut from 2 nights ago. He started crying immediately, the rage collapsing into sobbing apologies, reaching for me. But I was already moving, grabbing my phone from where he had dropped it, backing toward the bedroom. And when he lunged after me, I slammed the door and locked it with shaking hands. I heard him collapse against the wall outside, heard him crying and pleading. and I sat on the floor with my back against the door and my split lip bleeding onto my shirt and pulled up Dominic's number. And at 2 a.m., when the apartment finally went silent and I could hear Marcus snoring on the couch, I typed one word and hit send. The response came in 30 seconds. Just one word glowing on my cracked phone screen in the darkness of the locked bedroom. Address. My hands shook so badly I could barely type out the street name and apartment number. Each letter a commitment I could not take back. And the moment I hit send, his reply came through with the same terrifying efficiency. 20 minutes. Do not engage. Stay in locked room. I stared at those words and felt something shift inside me. Some final tether to my old life snapping clean. Because I was really doing this, really letting a man I had met once, a dangerous man whose world operated in shadows and violence, come to my apartment in the middle of the night to handle my problems in ways I could not let myself imagine too clearly. I moved on autopilot after that, pulling my battered duffel bag from the closet and stuffing clothes into it without caring what I grabbed. Adding my laptop and the small lockbox with my birth certificate and social security card, the only documents Marcus had not found and destroyed during one of his rages. And I worked in silence with my ear pressed to the door, listening to his snores rattling from the couch, thick and wet with alcohol and sleep. 18 minutes after I sent the address, I heard it. A knock so soft against the apartment door that I almost thought I imagined it. And I crept out of the bedroom with my heart hammering against my ribs, stepping over the creaking floorboard near the hallway that always woke Marcus. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw Dominic standing in the dingy corridor that suddenly looked too small to contain him. And beside him was another man, equally tall, equally dangerous. Both of them dressed in dark clothes that seemed to swallow the flickering fluorescent light. I opened the door and Dominic's eyes went straight to my face, tracking over the swelling on my cheek and my split lip, and I watched something terrible happen behind his expression, his features going utterly still, while his gray eyes turned to cold fire, a rage so controlled and absolute, it made the air around him feel heavy. "Where is he?" Dominic asked, his voice quiet in a way that promised destruction. And I pointed toward the living room where Marcus's snores continued undisturbed. And Dominic turned to the other man and said, "Antonio, take Elena downstairs to the car," and the command was absolute. I hesitated, my feet refusing to move, because some part of me needed to know what would happen, needed to witness the moment my old life ended. But Dominic looked at me with those burning eyes and said, "I promise you, Elena, he will not follow you." And then softer ever, and the certainty in his voice should have terrified me. This confirmation that he would do something irreversible and possibly unforgivable to Marcus. But instead, I felt a wave of relief so powerful, my knees almost buckled because someone was finally going to make it stop. Antonio turned out to be a man of few words, which I appreciated because I had none left in me, and he guided me down the narrow apartment stairs with a hand hovering near my elbow, never quite touching, but ready to steady me if I stumbled. And when we emerged onto the street, the black SUV waited like some sleek predator, windows tinted so dark I could not see inside, and he opened the back door and helped me in with surprising gentleness, for someone built like he could break a person in half without effort. The interior smelled like leather and something expensive I could not name, and Antonio handed me a bottle of water and a small package of tissues without comment. Just a brief nod before he closed the door and took position outside the vehicle, standing with his back to me, scanning the empty street like threats might materialize from the shadows between the flickering street lights. I sat in the silence and darkness and tried not to imagine what was happening 3 floors above me. Tried not to picture Dominic and Marcus in that cramped living room with its stained carpet and broken blinds, but my mind conjured images anyway, violence playing out in flashes behind my eyes. And I pressed the cold water bottle against my split lip and told myself I did not care what happened to Marcus, that he had made his choices and now faced the consequences. But guilt still twisted in my stomach because some part of me had been trained to feel responsible for male anger, trained to believe I caused the violence I received. I heard it then, voices raised and harsh filtering down through the building's thin walls. Marcus's voice high and panicked, another voice too low and controlled to make out words. And then silence, heavy and absolute. The kind of silence that meant something had shifted, something had ended. My hand started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the water bottle. And I watched the building in trance with my heart hammering against my ribs, counting seconds that stretched into hours. And then Dominic emerged, just walking out the front door like he had simply paid a social call, his clothes unmarked, his stride unhurried, and even from a distance I could see his face was composed, almost serene, no evidence of whatever had transpired upstairs except for something dark and satisfied in his eyes. When Antonio opened the door and Dominic slid into the back seat beside me, the driver, a silent figure I had not even registered before, started the engine without being told. And Dominic looked at me with those gray eyes that saw too much. And he said simply, "Go." And we pulled away from the curb, away from that building that had been my prison. And I finally found my voice and asked, "What did you do?" Needing to know, needing to understand what line he had crossed for me. Dominic was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight. And then he said, "Marcus received a clear message and a financial incentive to leave the city permanently. He will not bother you again." And his voice held such certainty, such absolute finality that I knew whatever had happened in that apartment had been thorough and terrifying, and probably involved threats I could not let myself imagine in detail. I should have felt guilty, should have felt afraid, should have questioned what kind of man solved problems with intimidation and violence. But instead, I felt something else entirely. A lightness spreading through my chest like I had been holding my breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. Liberation so profound it made me dizzy. Dominic asked, "Where do you want to go?" And the question was simple. But the answer was impossible because I had nowhere. No family who would take me in after I had ignored their warnings about Marcus. No friends left after he had systematically isolated me from everyone who cared. No money for a hotel or apartment deposit. Nothing except the clothes in my duffel bag and the bruises on my skin. I admitted I have nowhere, and the words tasted like failure. And Dominic studied me in the dim light filtering through the tinted windows, the city sliding past outside. And he said, "I have a guest house on my property, separate space, fully secure. You can stay there just until you stabilize, figure out your next steps." And I understood what he was really offering. Understood that accepting meant stepping fully into his world, the world of a man who could make other men disappear with a conversation and a financial incentive. But I also understood I was choosing this, choosing him, choosing whatever safety his dangerous protection could provide. We drove in silence through the empty streets, leaving behind everything familiar and broken, moving towards something unknown, but undeniably better than where I had been. And when we finally turned through iron gates onto a private drive lined with mature trees, I felt a strange sense of coming home. Like I had been wandering lost for years and finally found where I was supposed to be. The guest house was perfect, small but elegant, with clean lines and expensive furniture and windows that looked out onto manicured gardens. Everything Marcus's apartment was not. Peaceful, beautiful, safe. Dominic carried my single duffel bag inside and set it by the door, then turned to face me with an expression I could not read. "Fresh clothes in the closet," he said. "Food in the kitchen. Security codes for the doors and windows. You are safe here, Elena. No one will hurt you again." I felt tears prick my eyes and blink them back, because I had trained myself not to cry in front of men. But Dominic must have seen something in my face because he stepped closer, raised his hand slowly, giving me time to pull away. When I did not, he touched my cheek with infinite gentleness, his thumb brushing away a tear I had not realized had fallen. "Rest," he said. "We will talk tomorrow." And then he was gone, and I was alone in this beautiful space that felt like sanctuary. I stood in the middle of the living room and turned in a slow circle, taking in the soft lighting and comfortable furniture and the absence of fear. For the first time in 2 years, I was alone and safe. No one was going to hurt me. No one was going to scream at me or hit me or make me feel small. The relief was overwhelming. I curled up on the couch and cried for an hour. Great heaving sobs that felt like they were wringing out years of trapped pain. And when I was finished, when I had no tears left, I felt empty in the best possible way. Hollow but clean, ready to be filled with something better. I woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through windows I had left uncovered because I could. Because no one was there to tell me the light was too bright or the curtains were wrong. Because this space was mine, even temporarily. I made coffee in a kitchen stocked with expensive brands and real cream, sat at a table by the window, and watched birds move through the garden outside. Simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after so long without them. A soft knock at the door interrupted my reverie, and I opened it to find a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. "Mrs. Valencia," she said with a warm smile. "I help manage the house and grounds. Mr. Dominic asked me to see if you need anything." The kindness in her voice made my throat tight. "Just pointing me toward the closest grocery store," I said, because the idea of choosing my own food, buying what I wanted instead of what Marcus would tolerate, felt like freedom. Mrs. Valencia invited herself in, bustling around the kitchen with the ease of someone who belonged, and within minutes I found myself sitting across from her with fresh coffee and homemade pastries that tasted like heaven. She asked gentle questions about my comfort, the temperature, whether the bed was suitable, practical things that let me ease into conversation without feeling interrogated. And gradually, I found myself talking about small things. How long it had been since I had slept through the night without fear. How strange it felt to not have to account for every minute of my day. Mrs. Valencia listened with the kind of attention that made me feel heard, and when she left, she pressed a basket of food into my hands and told me to call if I needed anything. That evening, Dominic came to check on me. I heard his car in the driveway and watched through the window as he approached the guest house, moving with that same controlled grace, but somehow less predatory than before. When I opened the door, he studied my face with the focus of a man cataloging improvements, and something eased in his expression when he saw whatever he was looking for. "You look better," he said. "Rested." I invited him in, and we sat in the living room with glasses of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. The conversation flowed easier than I expected, moving from surface pleasantries into deeper territory. He asked about my life before Marcus, and I found myself telling him about college, about the business degree I never finished when my father died and the money ran out, about dreams of opening my own restaurant that seemed impossibly naive now. Dominic listened with genuine interest, asked thoughtful questions, and made me feel like my abandoned ambitions mattered, like they were still possible. In return, he shared pieces of his own story. Growing up in a world where violence was currency and loyalty was survival. Learning to read people and situations because misreading them could be fatal. The weight of inheriting an empire at an age when most people were still figuring out who they wanted to be. We talked until late, the conversation flowing like we had known each other for years instead of days. And when he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door and asked if I was comfortable with him visiting again, if his presence made me feel pressured or unsafe in any way. The question surprised me because I was used to men who took what they wanted without asking. But Dominic was different. He offered safety without demanding payment, gave help without expecting ownership. I told him I would like that. Would like to see him again. Days passed in a routine that felt like healing. Mornings with coffee and books from Dominic's extensive library. Afternoons with Mrs. Valencia, who seemed determined to feed me back to health and happiness. Evenings when Dominic would visit, and we would talk about everything and nothing, building something that felt like friendship but carried an undercurrent of attraction I was not quite ready to acknowledge. I felt myself changing, day by day, the constant tension in my shoulders easing, the habit of flinching when doors closed or voices raised slowly disappearing. I started sleeping through the night without nightmares. Started eating because food tasted good instead of just for survival. One evening, Dominic arrived looking tense in a way I had not seen before. His usual composed demeanor cracked around the edges, and I could sense trouble in the set of his shoulders. "Business difficulties," he said when I asked. Nothing I could not handle, but I could see the weight he carried. The decisions that had to be made in his world. The consequences that rippled out from every choice. I found myself wanting to help, wanting to ease whatever burden was making those gray eyes look so tired. I asked if he wanted to talk about it, expecting him to deflect or change the subject. Instead, he looked at me with something like surprise and said he had not had anyone to talk to about these things in a long time. So he told me about territory disputes and shifting alliances. Allies who were trustworthy until they were not. The constant chess game of his world where one wrong move could cost everything. I shared things I had never told anyone. The shame that lived in my chest about staying with Marcus so long. About making excuses and believing promises and returning again and again to someone who hurt me. The the crushing weight of feeling stupid and weak and complicit in my own suffering. Dominic stopped me mid-sentence, his hand covering mine on the table, and said, "Survivors do what they must to survive. There is no shame in that, only strength in the fact that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of sitting across from him and speaking truth." Our conversations deepened with each passing night, moving from facts and history into philosophy and dreams, and I caught him watching me sometimes with heat in his eyes that made my skin flush and my breath catch. An intensity that was different from his usual controlled focus, something raw and hungry that called to an answering need I was only beginning to acknowledge in myself. One night, reaching for my wine glass at the same moment he reached for his, our hands touched, and the contact was electric, a jolt that traveled from my fingertips straight to my core, and neither of us pulled away. Dominic's thumb stroked along my wrist, gentle and deliberate over the faded bruises that were now yellow and green, healing marks that no longer hurt except in memory. And he asked in a voice rough with restraint if he could touch my face. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and his hand came up to cup my cheek, warm and calloused and impossibly tender, and I leaned into his touch like a plant turning towards sunlight. He murmured that I was beautiful, and the way he said it made me believe him, made me feel beautiful in a way I had not felt in years, maybe ever, because Marcus's compliments had always come with conditions and criticisms attached. But Dominic's words felt like simple truth offered without expectation of anything in return. The moment shattered like dropped crystal when Dominic's phone buzzed against the table, harsh and insistent in the soft candle-lit space we had created, and his expression shifted from tender to severe in a heartbeat. The business mask sliding into place with practiced ease as he glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened in a way that told me this was not something he could ignore. He apologized, voice rough with reluctance and what might have been frustration, said he had to handle this immediately. It could not wait, and told me to stay, finish the wine, make myself comfortable in his study if I wanted. He would return as soon as possible. I nodded, tried to hide my disappointment, watched him stride from the room with that focused intensity that transformed him from the man who touched me, like I was precious, into something harder and more dangerous, the duality of him both fascinating and unsettling. I moved to his study because sitting alone in the dining room felt too exposed, too vulnerable, and the study was all dark wood and leather, and the scent of him, books lining the walls, and a massive desk positioned to face the windows overlooking the grounds. I saw the photos on his desk almost immediately, drawn to them like they held answers to questions I had not yet learned to ask. Young Dominic, maybe 10 or 11, with a beautiful woman who had his eyes in his bone structure, her smile radiant and her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of such casual affection that my heart ached looking at it, knowing what Dominic had told me about how she died. I heard raised voices outside, sharp and angry, cutting through the quiet night, and I moved to the window instinctively, looking out to see Dominic in the courtyard with a tall blonde man I had never seen before, their body language aggressive. The stranger gesturing wildly, while Dominic stood utterly still in that way that meant he was most dangerous. The man pointed toward the guest house, toward where I had been staying, toward me essentially. And even from this distance, I could see the accusation in the gesture, the challenge. Dominic stepped into the man's space, close enough that it was clearly a threat, his posture radiating violence, held on the thinnest leash, and the blonde man backed down immediately, hands raised in placation or surrender before he turned and walked quickly toward the front gates. Dominic stood there for a long moment after the man left, head bowed, hands clenched at his sides, before he turned and walked back toward the house with measured steps that spoke of iron control. He found me standing at the window when he entered the study. Must have known I had seen everything, and his expression was unreadable when he asked if I was all right. I asked if I was causing him problems, if my presence here was creating complications he did not need, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear him say it. He said nothing he could not handle, dismissive in a way that did not invite further questions. But I pressed anyway, asked who the man was. Dominic hesitated, a pause that felt weighted with calculation about what to tell me and what to withhold before he said that was Robert Mitchell, his second in command, and he had concerns about outsiders, about security, about variables he could not control. I understood immediately that I was the variable, the outsider, the complication, and I offered to leave, to remove myself from the equation. Even though the thought made something in my chest twist painfully, Dominic closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, crowding into my space, and said with absolute finality that I stayed. Tension stretched between us like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with potential energy and unspoken want. And I could feel the heat radiating from Dominic's body, where he stood so close that the space between us felt charged and dangerous in an entirely different way than the danger I had learned to recognize from his world. He asked in a voice low and rough if I understood what it meant to be under his protection, what it truly meant beyond the security and the guest house and the safety from Marcus. And I said I was beginning to understand that I saw how his men looked at me now, how Robert had come to assess whether I was worth the complication, how being associated with Dominic meant being marked as his in a way that both sheltered and exposed me. He asked if that frightened me, if he frightened me, and I admitted that everything about him should terrify me. This man who commanded criminal empires and inspired fear and dangerous men and had erased Marcus from my life with a few quiet words and probably violence I would never know the details of. But instead of fear, I felt safe for the first time in years. Felt like I could breathe fully without waiting for the next blow. Something shifted in Dominic's expression when I said that. The iron control he maintained so carefully slipping just enough that I could see the raw need beneath it. The one he had been restraining out of respect for my healing and my trauma and the power imbalance between us. He stepped closer, closing the last inches of distance, and framed my face with both hands, his palms warm and slightly rough against my cheeks, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbones, as he asked in a voice that shook slightly if he could kiss me. I whispered yes, barely able to force the word past the tightness in my throat and the hammering of my heart. And then his mouth was on mine, and it was nothing like kissing Marcus. Nothing like the demanding, possessive way Marcus had taken affection, like it was owed to him. Dominic kissed me like worship, like something sacred he had been granted permission to touch, his lips warm and firm but gentle, asking instead of taking, giving instead of demanding. And when I kissed him back, when I let my hands fist in his shirt and pulled him closer, he groaned against my mouth like I was giving him something he had not dared hope for. Their intimacy was transformative in ways I had not anticipated. Not just the physical connection, though that was revelatory in itself, but the way Dominic touched me like I was something precious and breakable and worthy of reverence. His hands careful around my healing bruises, his mouth gentle against the fading yellow marks on my ribs. And I felt worshipped in a way that made tears prick my eyes because I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with tenderness instead of ownership. Afterward, we lay tangled in his sheets, the expensive fabric cool against my overheated skin, and he traced idle patterns across my shoulder and down my arm, following the path of a bruise that had nearly disappeared. And he murmured that I was remarkable, that my strength amazed him, and I felt powerful in a new way that had nothing to do with physical capability and everything to do with being truly seen by someone who understood darkness. We talked deep into the night, our voices low and intimate in the cocoon of his bedroom, and he shared plans for legitimate business expansions he was working on, real estate developments, and security consulting contracts that could move more of his operations into legal territory. And I found myself offering suggestions from my abandoned business degree, ideas about market positioning and corporate structure that made his eyes light with interest. He listened, actually listened with the full weight of his attention, asked questions about my reasoning, incorporated my thoughts into his planning, and I realized with sudden clarity that I could have purpose here, that I did not have to be just the woman under his protection, but could be a partner in building something. Morning came too quickly, pale light filtering through the curtains, and Dominic kissed my forehead and said he had meetings with his organization leaders, important conversations about territory and alliances that could not be postponed. And then he surprised me by saying he wanted me to come with him, that it was time his inner circle met the woman who had become central to his life. My stomach fluttered with nerves as I dressed in clothes that felt too casual for meeting mob bosses. But Dominic assured me I was perfect, that I did not need to perform or impress anyone, that my presence itself made the statement he needed to make. We drove to a restaurant closed for private business, The kind of establishment that looked modest from outside, but inside was elegant and clearly secured, and in a back room sat 5 men who stood when we entered. Their eyes immediately, assessing me with the sharp attention of people whose survival depended on reading threats. Dominic introduced them by name and role. Robert Mitchell, whom I had already met, Antonio Rossi, who had helped rescue me from Marcus, and 3 others whose names and territories I tried to memorize, and they shook my hand with varying degrees of warmth, but universal weariness. Dominic did not sit, instead stood with his hand on my lower back, and made clear in concise words that I was not temporary, not a fling he would tire of, but someone under his full protection, who had become integral to his life, and anyone who threatened me answered to him personally. The temperature in the room shifted, something settling as the men exchanged glances and then nodded their acceptance. And I understood with crystal certainty that I had just crossed a threshold, that there was no going back to the woman who delivered pizzas and dreamed of escape, because I had entered Dominic's world permanently and irrevocably. Weeks passed in a blur of integration and transformation as I found myself woven into the fabric of Dominic's life in ways that felt both natural and surreal. And he gave me real work managing the legitimate sides of his business empire, the security consulting firm, and the real estate holdings that operated in full daylight with proper contracts and legal structures. I proved myself capable quickly, my abandoned business degree finally finding purpose as I streamlined operations and identified expansion opportunities. And I watched the men who had assessed me with such weariness begin to nod when I spoke in meetings to ask my opinion on deals, to treat me as more than just the boss's woman. Dominic and I grew closer with each passing day. Not just the physical attraction that flared between us constantly, though that was undeniable, but something deeper. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. He valued my input, sought my counsel on decisions both personal and professional, and I felt myself becoming someone I had never been before. Confident, capable, essential. Mrs. Valencia found me humming while making coffee in the guest house kitchen, and she gave me a knowing look, her eyes twinkling with barely suppressed amusement as she said, "I had a certain glow about me this morning," and she was happy to see it. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but could not stop smiling. And she patted my hand in that maternal way she had, and said, "Dominic deserved happiness, and perhaps I did, too." I spent the morning helping Mrs. Valencia with household tasks, needing purpose and activity to channel the restless energy humming through me. And she talked while we worked, sharing stories about Dominic, how she had come to work for him 15 years ago when he was just 19 and newly in charge of the family business, how fierce and brilliant and lonely he had been, how she had watched him build an empire but never let anyone truly close. In the afternoon, I was reading in the guest house when a knock at the door made me tense, instinctive weariness flooding through me because Dominic was gone, and I did not expect anyone. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw Robert Mitchell standing on the doorstep, looking polite but serious. I opened the door slowly, keeping it partially closed, and he smiled, but it did not reach his eyes as he asked if he could have a few minutes of my time. He was polite, carefully so, but cold in a way that made clear this was not a social visit. And once inside, he got straight to the point, said he needed to understand my intentions with Dominic. I bristled immediately, said that was between Dominic and me, none of his concern. But Robert shook his head and explained that everything involving Dominic was his concern because his job was keeping Dominic safe, and I was an unknown variable. He warned me that Dominic had enemies, serious, dangerous people who would not hesitate to use me to hurt him, that I was a liability whether I intended to be or not, and his eyes were hard when he said I needed to understand what staying meant. I stood firm despite my racing heart, lifted my chin, and said, "I never asked for any of this, but I was done running from fear, done making myself small to avoid danger, and if staying with Dominic meant risk, then that was my choice to make." Robert studied me for a long moment, reassessing, and something shifted in his expression before he nodded slowly and said, "Maybe I was stronger than I looked. Maybe I would survive this world after all." He left without another word, but I stood shaking after the door closed, adrenaline flooding through me as I realized I had just been tested and apparently passed. But the encounter left me unsettled and frighteningly aware of how much I still did not understand about the life I was choosing. I told Dominic about Robert's visit that night over dinner, my hands wrapped around a wine glass for something to hold. As I recounted the conversation, and I watched Dominic's expression darken with each detail until fury sparked in his gray eyes, and his jaw tightened with barely contained anger. He said Robert overstepped, that he had no right to interrogate me or make me feel threatened in what was supposed to be my safe space. And I could see him calculating consequences and responses even as he spoke. I reached across the table and touched his hand, stilling the tension coiled in his fingers, and said that Robert was protecting him, doing what he thought necessary to keep Dominic safe. And maybe I needed to understand that kind of loyalty, even if it made me uncomfortable. Dominic turned his hand over to grip mine, said that was not Robert's call to make, that I was not a security threat to be assessed and managed, but someone under his protection, and increasingly more than that. I said I understood this world had rules I did not know, codes and hierarchies and protocols that everyone else seemed to grasp instinctively. And if I was going to stay, then I needed to learn them, needed to understand how to navigate the structure around him. Dominic studied me across the candlelight, his expression shifting from anger to something more searching and vulnerable, and asked if I truly wanted into his life, if I understood what that meant beyond the surface attraction and the safety he provided. I met his eyes steadily and said I wanted him, that the rest came with that choice, and I was making it with open eyes. He warned me it meant danger, that his enemies would see me as leverage and target, that it meant secrecy, because much of what he did could never be spoken about openly, that it meant moral compromise because his world operated in shades of gray, where right and wrong blurred into expedience and survival. I said I went from one cage with Marcus to another kind of prison in the isolation and fear I had lived with. But this choice felt different because I was choosing it freely, choosing him and the life he offered with full knowledge of what it contained. Something flashed in his eyes, heat and possession and need all tangled together, and he stood abruptly and came around the table to pull me to my feet and then into his arms. He kissed me deeply, hungrily, with none of the careful restraint he had shown before, and I responded with matching intensity, my hands fisting in his shirt as I pressed closer. He lifted me easily, my legs wrapping around his waist as he carried me toward the stairs. And halfway up, he stopped to pin me against the wall and asked again if I was sure, if this was what I wanted. I answered by kissing him harder, by pulling at his clothes with trembling hands, by whispering yes against his mouth until he groaned and carried me the rest of the way to his bedroom. Their intimacy was transformative in ways I had not anticipated. Not just the physical connection, though that was revelatory in itself, but the way Dominic touched me like I was something precious and breakable and worthy of reverence. His hands careful around my healing bruises, his mouth gentle against the fading yellow marks on my ribs. And I felt worshipped in a way that made tears prick my eyes because I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with tenderness instead of ownership. Afterward, we lay tangled in his sheets, the expensive fabric cool against my overheated skin, and he traced idle patterns across my shoulder and down my arm, following the path of a bruise that had nearly disappeared. And he murmured that I was remarkable, that my strength amazed him, and I felt powerful in a new way that had nothing to do with physical capability and everything to do with being truly seen by someone who understood darkness. We talked deep into the night, our voices low and intimate in the cocoon of his bedroom, and he shared plans for legitimate business expansions he was working on, real estate developments, and security consulting contracts that could move more of his operations into legal territory. And I found myself offering suggestions from my abandoned business degree, ideas about market positioning and corporate structure that made his eyes light with interest. He listened, actually listened with the full weight of his attention, asked questions about my reasoning, incorporated my thoughts into his planning, and I realized with sudden clarity that I could have purpose here, that I did not have to be just the woman under his protection, but could be a partner in building something. Morning came too quickly, pale light filtering through the curtains, and Dominic kissed my forehead and said he had meetings with his organization leaders, important conversations about territory and alliances that could not be postponed. And then he surprised me by saying he wanted me to come with him, that it was time his inner circle met the woman who had become central to his life. My stomach fluttered with nerves as I dressed in clothes that felt too casual for meeting mob bosses. But Dominic assured me I was perfect, that I did not need to perform or impress anyone, that my presence itself made the statement he needed to make. We drove to a restaurant closed for private business, the kind of establishment that looked modest from outside, but inside was elegant and clearly secured, and in a back room sat 5 men who stood when we entered. Their eyes immediately, assessing me with the sharp attention of people whose survival depended on reading threats. Dominic introduced them by name and role. Robert Mitchell, whom I had already met, Antonio Rossi, who had helped rescue me from Marcus, and 3 others whose names and territories I tried to memorize, and they shook my hand with varying degrees of warmth, but universal weariness. Dominic did not sit, instead stood with his hand on my lower back, and made clear in concise words that I was not temporary, not a fling he would tire of, but someone under his full protection, who had become integral to his life, and anyone who threatened me answered to him personally. The temperature in the room shifted, something settling as the men exchanged glances and then nodded their acceptance. And I understood with crystal certainty that I had just crossed a threshold, that there was no going back to the woman who delivered pizzas and dreamed of escape, because I had entered Dominic's world permanently and irrevocably. Weeks passed in a blur of integration and transformation as I found myself woven into the fabric of Dominic's life in ways that felt both natural and surreal. And he gave me real work managing the legitimate sides of his business empire, the security consulting firm, and the real estate holdings that operated in full daylight with proper contracts and legal structures. I proved myself capable quickly, my abandoned business degree finally finding purpose as I streamlined operations and identified expansion opportunities. And I watched the men who had assessed me with such weariness begin to nod when I spoke in meetings to ask my opinion on deals, to treat me as more than just the boss's woman. Dominic and I grew closer with each passing day. Not just the physical attraction that flared between us constantly, though that was undeniable, but something deeper. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. He valued my input, sought my counsel on decisions both personal and professional, and I felt myself becoming someone I had never been before. Confident, capable, essential. But nothing in his world stayed simple for long. The threat came in the form of a phone call that shattered our carefully constructed peace. I was in Dominic's office, reviewing contracts for a new security client, when his phone rang and his expression went cold in a way that made my blood freeze. He answered with a single word, "Yes," and then listened for a long moment, his face growing darker with each passing second. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "You have 24 hours. And then he hung up and turned to me with eyes like winter storms. "We need to go. Now." I did not argue, did not ask questions, just grabbed my purse and followed him out to the car where Antonio waited, engine running. And as we pulled away from the office, Dominic finally told me what I already suspected in my gut. Marcus had found me. Somehow, despite the threats and the financial incentives and the clear message that he should disappear, he had tracked me down. And now he wanted what he thought was his. The safe house was in the mountains, a cabin hidden away from everything, surrounded by trees and silence. But even there, I could not shake the feeling of being hunted. Dominic posted guards, made phone calls, coordinated with his organization to track Marcus down. But the man I had lived with for 2 years was proving more resourceful than anyone had anticipated. And I watched uncertainty flicker across his face before rage replaced it. He hit me hard across the face, and I tasted blood again. That familiar copper tang, but I did not break or beg because I was not the same woman he had terrorized, and I knew with absolute certainty that Dominic was already coming for me. Gunfire erupted outside the warehouse in sharp staccato bursts that made Marcus's head snap toward the sound, his bravado crumbling into panic as he realized Dominic had not come to negotiate, but to wage war. And I watched Marcus's hand shake as he pulled a gun from his waistband and pressed the cold metal against my temple, his voice high and desperate as he screamed that he would kill me if anyone came closer. The warehouse door exploded inward with a boom that reverberated through my bones, and Dominic walked through the smoke and chaos like an avenging angel, alone with his hands visible and empty. But his face was death itself, all cold fury and lethal promise. And I had never seen anything more terrifying or more beautiful. Marcus's gun pressed harder against my skull as he shouted that Dominic needed to back off, or I would die. That he wanted guarantees of safe passage and money and a dozen impossible things. But Dominic's voice when he spoke was calm and certain as a blade, telling Marcus to let me go, and he could walk away, that this did not need to end in more bloodshed. Marcus laughed wildly and said he was not stupid enough to believe that lie, that Dominic would hunt him forever, and I felt the tremor in Marcus's body behind me, fear and desperation making him unpredictable and more dangerous. Dominic's eyes found mine across the space between us, and I saw the message there as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud, the slight tilt of his head and the focus of his gaze telling me to trust him, to be ready. And I understood with perfect clarity what needed to happen. I threw my weight backwards suddenly, the chair tilting on its back legs, and Marcus's gun jerked away from my head as he tried to compensate for the shift. And in that fraction of a second, Dominic moved with deadly precision, his hand producing a weapon I had not seen, and firing once with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times before. Marcus dropped like a puppet with cut strings, the gun clattering across concrete, and I hit the ground hard, still tied to the chair, pain radiating through my shoulder and hip. But I was alive, and Marcus was not. Dominic was beside me in an instant, his hands steady as he cut through the zip ties with a knife that appeared from somewhere, his fingers gentle as they touched my face and checked my injuries, cataloging the new bruises Marcus had added to my collection. And I was shaking so hard my teeth chattered. But I managed to tell him I was okay, that I was not broken, that we were both still here. The drive back to the estate was silent, both of us processing what had happened, what it meant. Marcus was gone forever this time. There would be no coming back from this, no second chances, no threats hanging over our heads. But the cost had been high. I had seen Dominic kill a man with my own eyes, had watched the life leave someone I had once thought I loved, even if that love had been twisted and poisonous. In the weeks that followed, I struggled with conflicting emotions. Relief warred with guilt. Gratitude battled with horror. I had wanted Marcus gone, had needed him gone, but witnessing the reality of that wish fulfilled left me changed in ways I was still understanding. Dominic was patient with my processing, never pushing for resolution or demanding that I simply be grateful. He understood that violence, even justified violence, left scars on everyone it touched, and he helped me work through the complicated tangle of emotions without judgment or impatience. Slowly, I found my equilibrium again. The nightmares faded. The guilt settled into something manageable, and I began to see clearly what my life had become, what we had built together in the aftermath of destruction. It was not simple. It was not safe. But it was mine. Ours. Chosen freely and defended fiercely. I responded that I had found myself in his protection, discovered strength I had not known I possessed, and together we had built something real and lasting from the broken pieces we had both carried. Neither of us was perfect, and our life together would never be simple or safe. But we were perfect together in our imperfection. Two damaged people who had recognized something essential in each other that first night, when a pizza delivery to the wrong address had changed both our lives forever, and the future stretched before us dangerous and uncertain, but utterly ours to claim and defend and shape into whatever we chose to make it. 6 months after Marcus died, I was still learning the intricate rules of Dominic's world. Every morning brought new lessons in the delicate balance of power that kept his empire functioning. I discovered that violence was only one tool in an arsenal that included diplomacy, economics, and psychological warfare executed with surgical precision. Dominic trusted me with more responsibilities each week, and I found myself coordinating between legitimate businesses and shadow operations with increasing skill. The security consulting firm became my primary focus, and I threw myself into building relationships with corporate clients who had no idea they were contracting with a criminal organization. My business degree finally found purpose as I developed marketing strategies and client retention programs that tripled our revenue within 4 months. The work felt clean in a way that surprised me, professional interactions conducted in glass offices with PowerPoint presentations and catered meetings. But underneath the veneer of legitimacy, I always knew we were providing protection from threats that sometimes included other members of Dominic's organization. Robert Mitchell remained skeptical of my presence, though his hostility had evolved into grudging respect. He tested me constantly with subtle challenges, probing for weakness or divided loyalties. When a client expressed concerns about security breaches, Robert suggested I handle the investigation personally, watching carefully as I navigated the delicate process of uncovering industrial espionage without exposing our own methods. I discovered the leak came from a competitor's organization, and when I presented my findings to Dominic with a recommendation for strategic response, Robert nodded slowly and said perhaps I understood the game better than he had initially assessed. The acknowledgement felt like a victory, acceptance from the man whose job it was to protect Dominic from all threats, including me. Antonio Rossi became something like a friend, if friendship was possible in a world where loyalty was currency and trust was earned through blood. He taught me to read people the way he read potential threats, identifying tells and weaknesses that could be exploited or protected. We spent hours discussing human psychology, the patterns that made people predictable, the pressure points that could turn allies into enemies or enemies into assets. Antonio had a philosopher's mind wrapped in an enforcer's body, and he helped me understand that violence was often the least efficient solution to complicated problems. When local politicians began pressuring our legitimate businesses with unnecessary regulations, Antonio showed me how carefully placed social pressure and economic incentives could resolve conflicts without bloodshed. Mrs. Valencia continued to mother me with fierce protectiveness, but she also began sharing stories about the organization's history that helped me understand my place in a legacy stretching back generations. She told me about Dominic's grandmother, a woman who had run operations from her kitchen table while raising 5 children, commanding respect through intelligence and ruthlessness equally. About his great-uncle who had built the foundation of their territory through strategic marriages and calculated betrayals. I learned that women in this world were not decorations or victims, but powers operating behind the scenes, influencing decisions through subtle manipulation and economic control. Mrs. Valencia explained that my role was not unprecedented, that strong women had always shaped the direction of criminal families, but usually from shadows. Dominic was unusual in bringing me into the light, making me visible as his partner rather than hidden as his secret weapon. The first real test came when Vincent Torino, head of a rival family, requested a meeting to discuss territorial boundaries. Torino had been encroaching on shipping routes that belonged to Dominic's organization, testing boundaries and challenging authority with increasing boldness. The meeting was set for neutral ground, a restaurant owned by an elderly Italian woman whose family connections made her property sacred to all factions. Dominic wanted me there, he said, because Torino would bring his wife, and the dynamics of such meetings shifted when women were present. I spent days preparing, studying files on both Torino and his wife Maria, understanding their history and motivations, identifying potential leverage points and red lines that could not be crossed. The dinner was an elaborate dance of politeness wrapped around lethal negotiation. Torino was in his 50s, silver-haired and charming, with eyes that missed nothing. Maria appeared decorative at first glance, but I caught the way she guided conversation with subtle redirections and how her husband deferred to her judgment on key points. They presented a united front, but careful observation revealed the real power structure. Maria made the strategic decisions, while Vincent provided the muscle to enforce them. I found myself in an unexpected chess match with her, each of us probing for weakness while maintaining perfect social courtesy. When Torino suggested that young organizations sometimes overestimated their territorial claims, I smiled and mentioned that established families occasionally forgot that territories must be defended to be maintained. Maria's eyes sharpened with interest, and I knew she understood that I was not merely Dominic's beautiful companion, but someone who grasped the implications of power. The negotiations stretched over 3 hours, moving through courses of food and bottles of wine, while underlying tensions simmered beneath surface pleasantries. Dominic and Vincent discussed shipping schedules and dock access with careful precision, each man probing for advantage while avoiding direct confrontation. But the real resolution came through Maria and me, as we established the personal relationships that would make future cooperation possible. I learned that Maria's daughter was starting college, struggling with the isolation of being connected to a criminal family, and I offered resources through our legitimate businesses that could provide both opportunities and protection. In return, Maria shared intelligence about federal investigations that could affect all our operations, information that proved invaluable in the months that followed. By the end of the evening, territorial boundaries were redrawn in ways that benefited both families, and I had established myself as someone capable of conducting diplomacy at the highest levels. Dominic was quiet during the drive home, processing what he had observed. When we finally spoke, he said he had watched me become someone he had not fully imagined when we first met. That my instincts for negotiation and alliance building were natural gifts he had not anticipated. I told him I was discovering abilities I had never known I possessed, skills that years with Marcus had buried beneath survival mode, but never destroyed. We talked about expanding my role, giving me authority to conduct negotiations independently, positioning me as someone other families would need to consider in their strategic planning. The conversation felt like another threshold crossed, another step toward becoming true partners in every sense. Winter brought new challenges when federal investigators began scrutinizing our security consulting contracts. Someone had leaked information about connections between our legitimate businesses and shadow operations, triggering audit procedures that threatened to expose carefully constructed barriers between legal and illegal activities. Dominic suspected internal betrayal, but identifying the source required delicate investigation that could not appear suspicious to outside observers. I volunteered to conduct the inquiry through my position in the consulting firm, using my access to personnel files and financial records to trace information flows. The investigation consumed weeks of careful detective work, tracking digital communications and financial transactions through layers of corporate structures designed to obscure connections. The betrayal came from an unexpected source. Michael Chun, one of our most trusted IT specialists, had been providing federal agents with detailed information about our operations in exchange for immunity from prosecution on unrelated charges. Michael had created our secure communication systems, installed our digital security protocols, and maintained the firewalls between legitimate and illegitimate activities. His position gave him access to information that could destroy the entire organization. When I presented evidence of his treachery to Dominic, the fury in his eyes reminded me why people feared him. But his response was measured rather than explosive, a careful calculation of consequences and strategic necessities that demonstrated the control that made him dangerous. The confrontation with Michael took place in the basement of a warehouse owned by one of our shipping companies. I insisted on being present, and Dominic did not argue, understanding that my involvement in uncovering the betrayal gave me the right to witness its resolution. Michael broke down the moment he saw the evidence laid out before him, confessing everything through tears and desperate justifications about protecting his family from federal prosecution. Dominic listened without expression, asking precise questions about what information had been shared, which operations had been compromised, how much damage needed to be contained. When Michael finished speaking, Dominic stood quietly for a long moment, and I could feel the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. The killing was quick and efficient, a single shot that echoed through the concrete space with finality. I watched without flinching, though my heart hammered against my ribs, because I understood this was justice in the world I had chosen. Michael's betrayal had endangered everyone in our organization, threatened the lives and freedom of dozens of people who depended on our protection. Dominic had made the only choice available to a leader responsible for so many lives. Afterward, we sat in his office until dawn, talking through the implications of what we had learned, planning damage control strategies, identifying security vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. I felt like a true partner in those conversations, contributing strategic thinking that Dominic valued and implemented. Spring arrived with opportunities for expansion that tested our partnership in new ways. A legitimate construction company was struggling with financial difficulties, and the owner approached us for assistance. The business was perfect for our needs, providing cover for movement of materials and personnel while generating substantial profits through public contracts. But purchasing the company required navigating complex negotiations with multiple government agencies, a process that would scrutinize our financing and business practices with uncomfortable intensity. I proposed a solution that involved creating a series of shell corporations to obscure the source of our investment, a strategy that would allow us to gain control while maintaining plausible deniability about criminal connections. The acquisition took months to complete, requiring patience and careful attention to legal details that could expose us if handled incorrectly. I worked with attorneys and accountants to structure the purchase through legitimate investment vehicles, creating paper trails that would satisfy regulatory oversight while hiding the true source of funding. The complexity challenged every skill I had developed, forcing me to become expert in corporate law and financial engineering practically overnight. Dominic gave me complete authority over the process, trusting my judgment even when his advisors questioned strategies they did not fully understand. When the purchase finally closed, we controlled a company worth millions of dollars that provided both immediate profits and long-term strategic advantages. Success brought new enemies, including Thomas Ricci, whose family had controlled construction in our territory for generations. Ricci viewed our acquisition as an act of war, a challenge to authority that demanded response. He began targeting our employees with intimidation tactics, bribing inspectors to create regulatory problems, and spreading rumors about our business practices to potential clients. The pressure campaign was sophisticated and relentless, designed to force us to abandon our expansion or escalate to open conflict. I suggested an alternative approach that involved isolating Ricci from his allies through targeted economic pressure, demonstrating that his attacks on us ultimately threatened everyone's profits. The strategy required months of patient implementation, identifying businesses that depended on both our organizations, then gradually increasing costs and reducing opportunities for companies that supported Ricci's resistance. We offered exclusive contracts to firms that severed relationships with his family, created more favorable terms for suppliers who chose sides, and used our legitimate businesses to crowd his operations out of the most lucrative markets. The campaign was bloodless but devastating, slowly starving his organization of the resources needed to maintain their territorial claims. When Ricci finally requested a meeting to negotiate resolution, his position had weakened to the point where he could only ask for terms rather than demand concessions. The negotiation took place on his territory, a restaurant he had controlled for decades, but the balance of power had shifted completely. Ricci was older than I had expected, perhaps 70, with the bearing of a man who had commanded respect through generations of violence. But age and economic pressure had weathered him, and I could see the fear in his eyes when he looked at me. He had expected to negotiate with Dominic alone, following traditional protocols between family heads. My presence disrupted those expectations, forcing him to acknowledge that power structures were changing in ways he did not understand. I let Dominic handle the opening formalities, but when discussion turned to specific territorial boundaries and future cooperation, I became active in the conversation. The resolution satisfied everyone's essential needs while establishing clear hierarchies for future interactions. Ricci maintained control over his traditional territories, but acknowledged our authority over construction projects above a certain value threshold. His family received guaranteed subcontracting opportunities on our major jobs, ensuring their continued survival while making them dependent on our goodwill. In return, he provided intelligence about federal investigations affecting all construction companies in the region, information that proved crucial for avoiding regulatory problems. The agreement was sealed with dinner and handshakes, traditional ceremonies that masked the fundamental shift in power that had occurred. Summer brought personal challenges when I discovered I was pregnant. The news terrified and thrilled me in equal measure, because children changed everything in a world where violence was always possible. Dominic's reaction was immediate and protective, his first instinct to send me somewhere safe, where rival families could not reach me. But I refused to disappear, insisting that pregnancy did not make me weak or incapable of continuing my responsibilities. We argued for weeks about security protocols and risk management, finding compromise positions that satisfied his need to protect me and my determination to remain active in our operations. The pregnancy progressed without complications, but my expanding role in the organization attracted attention from law enforcement agencies tracking criminal families through electronic surveillance and financial investigations. Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI contacted me directly, requesting an interview about our security consulting business as part of a routine investigation into government contracting procedures. The meeting was clearly a fishing expedition, an attempt to gather intelligence about our operations through seemingly innocent questions about business practices. I agreed to the interview with Dominic's approval, understanding that refusing would create more suspicion than cooperation. Agent Martinez was younger than I expected, perhaps 35, with sharp eyes and careful speech that revealed extensive training in interrogation techniques. She asked questions about our client acquisition process, employee background checks, and subcontracting relationships with other security firms. The inquiries appeared routine on the surface, but I recognized the underlying patterns designed to elicit information about criminal connections. I answered with complete honesty about our legitimate operations while deflecting attempts to probe deeper into questionable areas. The interview lasted 2 hours, and I left feeling confident that I had provided nothing useful while maintaining the appearance of full cooperation. The federal investigation intensified over the following months, with agents conducting surveillance and interviewing employees from multiple businesses in our portfolio. Dominic made the difficult decision to temporarily reduce our criminal operations, focusing exclusively on legitimate activities until the pressure diminished. The strategy cost us significant revenue and required delicate negotiations with other families who depended on our services, but it successfully frustrated the investigation by removing evidence of illegal activities. I coordinated the transition with help from Robert Mitchell, who had become grudgingly supportive of my strategic thinking even as he maintained skepticism about my long-term reliability. Our daughter was born in October, a perfect child we named Sophia after Dominic's grandmother. Holding her for the first time transformed something fundamental in my understanding of what we had built together. This tiny person represented hope and continuity, a future that extended beyond the immediate dangers and complexities of our current life. Dominic was immediately devoted, spending hours watching Sophia sleep, marveling at her tiny fingers and the way she gripped his hand with surprising strength. We hired additional security and restructured our living arrangements to ensure her protection, but I insisted on maintaining as normal a life as possible despite the extraordinary circumstances. Sophia's birth coincided with the conclusion of the federal investigation, which ended without charges being filed against anyone in our organization. Agent Martinez called to thank me for my cooperation and mentioned that they had found no evidence of improper activities in our security consulting business. The clean conclusion vindicated our strategy of temporary withdrawal from criminal operations, demonstrating that patience and careful planning could overcome even intensive law enforcement scrutiny. Dominic celebrated by expanding our legitimate businesses aggressively, using profits accumulated during months of reduced operations to acquire new properties and contracts. The first year of Sophia's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and profound joy, punctuated by the ongoing demands of running an increasingly complex organization. I learned to balance motherhood with strategic planning, conducting business meetings while nursing, reviewing financial reports during nap time, negotiating territorial agreements over baby monitors. Mrs. Valencia became invaluable during this period, providing childcare expertise and emotional support when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. Dominic proved to be an attentive father despite his demanding responsibilities, rearranging his schedule to be present for important milestones and sharing nighttime feeding duties with determination that touched my heart. By Sophia's first birthday, we had successfully transitioned from a primarily criminal organization to a hybrid structure that generated most of its revenue through legitimate businesses while maintaining strategic criminal capabilities for situations requiring them. The transformation had taken 3 years of careful planning and patient execution, but the results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Our security consulting firm employed more than 200 people and held contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. The construction company had expanded into 3 states and was bidding on municipal projects that would establish us as a regional power in the industry. The changes created new challenges as we navigated the complexities of operating in both legal and illegal spheres simultaneously. Employees in our legitimate businesses knew nothing about criminal activities, requiring careful compartmentalization of information and personnel. We developed sophisticated protocols for keeping the two sides of our operations separate while allowing for strategic coordination when necessary. I became expert at code switching between personas, conducting morning meetings about government contracts before attending afternoon discussions about territorial disputes, always maintaining appropriate boundaries between different aspects of my responsibilities. Our success attracted attention from other criminal families seeking similar transitions from traditional organized crime to hybrid organizations. Vincent Torino requested a private meeting to discuss partnership opportunities, having observed our transformation with interest and respect. The conversation took place at his estate, a sprawling property that demonstrated the wealth accumulated through generations of criminal enterprise. Vincent had aged visibly since our last meeting, and I suspected health problems were motivating his interest in legitimizing his own operations. Maria appeared frilier as well, though her intelligence remained sharp as she evaluated our achievements and assessed whether cooperation would benefit their family. The partnership we developed gave Torino's organization access to our legitimate business infrastructure in exchange for their established relationships with labor unions and local politicians. Their connections provided competitive advantages in bidding for construction contracts, while our corporate structure offered vehicles for legitimizing their accumulated wealth. The collaboration required extensive negotiations about territorial boundaries and profit-sharing arrangements, but the benefits to both families justified the complexity. Within months, we were collaborating on municipal projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars while maintaining strict separation between criminal activities. The success of our hybrid model attracted federal attention once again, but this time investigators focused on our rapid business expansion rather than criminal activities. Agent Martinez returned with questions about our financing sources and growth strategies, probing for evidence of money laundering or illegal investment schemes. The investigation required months of document production and testimony from key personnel, but our careful financial engineering had created legitimate paper trails that satisfied regulatory scrutiny. When the investigation concluded without charges, Agent Martinez admitted privately that our business practices, while aggressive, appeared to be entirely legal. As Sophia began walking and talking, I found myself thinking more about the future we were building for her. The world we inhabited was dangerous and morally complex, but it also provided resources and opportunities unavailable to most families. Our legitimate businesses could support her education and ambitions without requiring involvement in criminal activities, while our organization's power could protect her from threats that money alone could not address. Dominic and I had long conversations about how to raise a child with accurate understanding of our world while preserving her innocence and providing normal childhood experiences. The solution involved creating multiple layers of protection around Sophia's daily life, while gradually introducing age-appropriate information about our family's unique circumstances. We enrolled her in an exclusive private school with sophisticated security measures, surrounded her with carefully vetted caregivers and teachers, and maintained detailed protocols for emergency situations. But we also insisted on normal activities like playground visits and birthday parties, determined to give her childhood experiences that transcended the extraordinary nature of our situation. On quiet evenings when business demands finally subsided, Dominic and I would sit together watching Sophia play, marveling at how much our lives had changed since that night when a wrong address brought us together. The journey from pizza delivery to criminal partnership to legitimate business empire seemed impossible in retrospect, a series of choices and circumstances that defied probability. But we had survived every challenge, adapted to every threat, and built something lasting from the broken pieces of our former lives. I responded that I had found myself in his protection, discovered strength I had not known I possessed, and together we had built something real and lasting from the broken pieces we had both carried. Neither of us was perfect, and our life together would never be simple or safe. But we were perfect together in our imperfection. Two damaged people who had recognized something essential in each other that first night when a pizza delivery to the wrong address had changed both our lives forever, and the future stretched before us dangerous and uncertain, but utterly ours to claim and defend and shape into whatever we chose to make it.